Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. Picture this. You're witnessing a crime that will stain a nation for centuries. The date is February 10th, 1306. Inside the Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries, the air is freezing, but the tempers are boiling. Standing before the holy altar is Robert the Bruce. Facing him is his greatest rival, John the Red Comyn. Words fail, steel flashes. Bruce draws a dagger and jams it into Comyn's chest. The victim collapses, bleeding out on the sacred flagstones. This is a mortal sin committed in the house of God. By morning, Bruce will not be a king. He will be a sacrilegious outlaw hunted by every sword in Christendom. How did a calculated politician lose control so violently? And why did this murder become the only path to Scotland's freedom? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing to Crimson Legacy Historians for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're watching from. It's incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand that dagger thrust, we must rewind 20 years. Scotland was leaderless. King Alexander III had fallen off a cliff in the dark, snapping his neck in the royal line in a single moment. The kingdom spiraled into a power vacuum known as the Great Cause. 13 men claimed the empty throne, circling it like vultures. Fearing civil war, the Scottish nobles made a catastrophic mistake. They asked Edward I of England to pick the winner. Edward, known as Longshanks, saw an opportunity, not a duty. He marched his armies to the border and forced the Scots to kneel. He chose John Balliol as king solely because Balliol was weak enough to control. Bruce's family refused to bow. They watched in rage as Edward treated Scotland like a feudal estate. When Balliol finally tried to resist, Edward crushed him. The English army sacked Berwick in 1296, butchering thousands of civilians in hours. They stripped Balliol of his royal insignia and dragged him to the Tower of London. Scotland ceased to be a kingdom. It became an occupied territory. Robert the Bruce learned a hard lesson from this carnage. Honor gets you killed. Power gets you the crown. He played both sides, serving Edward when necessary, supporting rebels when convenient. He waited for the old lion, Edward I, to weaken. By 1306, the waiting game was over. William Wallace was dead, quartered by English butchers. Only Comyn stood between Bruce and the throne. Comyn had connections to the old royal line and deep ties to England. He was the obstacle that had to be removed. They met at Greyfriars under a truce. Bruce accused Comyn of betrayal, leaking plans to King Edward. The argument exploded. Bruce struck first. He panicked, fleeing the church to find his men outside. He told them, "I doubt I've slain the Red Comyn." Roger Kirkpatrick, his lieutenant, drew his blade. "You doubt?" he sneered. "I'll make sure." Kirkpatrick charged into the sanctuary and finished the job. The sacrilege was complete. Bruce wiped the blood from his hands and realized there was no going back. He had to seize the crown immediately or he would lose his head. Speed was now the only strategy left. With Comyn's blood drying on the church floor, Robert the Bruce raced north to Scone, the ancient crowning place of Scottish kings. He had to legitimize his claim before the English armies could cross the border. But when he arrived at Scone in late March, the hollowness of his position became painfully clear. The coronation was a shambles. The stone of destiny, the sacred rock upon which every Scottish monarch had sat for centuries, was gone. Edward I, Longshanks, had stolen it 10 years earlier, dragging it down to Westminster Abbey to sit under his own throne, a heavy, literal metaphor for English dominance. Bruce had to sit on a plain wooden chair. The royal robes were missing, likely locked away in English vaults, so he wore borrowed vestments that didn't quite fit. Even the crown was a hasty fabrication, a circle of gold melted down and hammered into shape in a few days. Worse than the missing props were the missing people. The greats of Scotland stayed away, terrified of being associated with a sacrilegious murderer. By tradition, the Earl of Fife had the honor of placing the crown on the king's head. The current earl was a teenager growing up in England, loyal to Edward. In a twist of dramatic irony, his sister, Isabella Macduff, the Countess of Buchan, stole her husband's best war horses and rode hard to Scone. She arrived just in time to perform her family's duty, placing the golden circlet on Bruce's brow. It was a brave act that would cost her dearly, News of this rebellion reached London, and the reactio N was theatrical in its rage. King Edward I was 66 years old, sick and dying. He had to be carried in a litter because he could barely ride. Yet his hatred for the Scots revitalized him. At the Palace of Westminster, he held a grand feast known as the Feast of the Swans. 2 swans adorned with gold networks were brought before the court. Edward swore a solemn oath to God and the swans that he would march north, punish the usurper Bruce, and never sleep 2 nights in the same place until Scotland was crushed. He knighted his son, the future Edward II, and nearly 300 other young nobles, creating an instant army of vengeance. He also issued a chilling decree: no quarter. Unlike the wars against William Wallace, where capture was possible, this was a manhunt. Bruce was not a soldier, he was a criminal. The dragon flag was raised, a symbol that meant deadly warfare, signaling that the laws of chivalry were suspended. Bruce, however, had not yet received the memo. He was still fighting the last war. In June 1306 he marched his small army to Perth, which was held by the English commander, Aymer de Valence. Bruce arrived outside the walls, knights in gleaming armor, banners waving. He sent a herald to the gates, challenging Valence to come out and fight a proper battle. Valence, a seasoned pragmatist, looked down from the walls. He replied that it was too late in the day for a brawl. They would fight tomorrow. Satisfied that honor had been served, Bruce withdrew his forces a few miles to the woods of Methven. They made camp. They took off their armor. They started cooking dinner. They assumed the English would respect the rules of war. Valence did not wait for tomorrow. Under cover of twilight, the English cavalry thundered out of Perth. They caught the Scots completely unprepared. The Battle of Methven was not a contest, it was a mugging. Bruce's army was shattered before they could form a line. Men were butchered in their shirts, scrambling for swords in the dark. Bruce himself was nearly captured 3 times in the chaos. He was unhorsed, pulled to the muddy ground, and only saved by a few loyal knights who practically threw him onto a stray mount. The King of Scots fled into the darkness, leaving his army dead or dying behind him. The defeat was absolute. The psychological blow was worse. Bruce had tried to be a traditional king, fighting a traditional war, and he had been humiliated. His wife, his daughter, and the brave Isabella Macduff were soon captured as they tried to flee north. Edward ordered them locked in wooden cages and hung from the walls of Roxburgh and Berwick castles, exposed to the elements and the jeers of the crowd like circus animals. By winter, Robert the Bruce was king of nothing but the heather and the mist. He had no army, no family, and no castle. He was a fugitive in his own realm, hunted by English soldiers and, perhaps more dangerously, by the relatives of the Red Comyn, who wanted blood for blood. The King of Summer had fallen. The long winter of survival had begun. The winter of 1306 was not just a season, it was an executioner. Robert the Bruce, the man who would be king, was reduced to a scarecrow figure, stumbling through the heather of the Scottish Highlands. The English army held the castles, but the wilderness held something far worse, the MacDougals. This is a crucial detail often missed in the English versus Scots narrative. The Scottish Wars of Independence were also a vicious blood feud. The MacDougall clan was allied by marriage to the murdered John Comyn. They didn't care about politics, they wanted revenge. When Bruce tried to slip west towards the coast, the MacDougals were waiting for him at a place called Dalry, the King's Field. It wasn't a battle, it was a chaotic ambush in a narrow glen. Highlanders swarmed down from the rocks, screaming for Bruce's head. In the melee, Bruce was cut off from his men. 3 attackers lunged at him simultaneously, one grabbing his bridle, another his leg, a third leaping onto the horse's rump behind him. Bruce survived only through brute strength and panic. He smashed the first man with the hilt of his sword, spurred his horse to trample the second, and threw the third man off his back with a shrug of his shoulders. But in the struggle, the MacDougall snatched his cloak, tearing away a silver brooch to keep as a trophy. That brooch, the Brooch of Lorne, is still held by the MacDougall clan chief today, a physical receipt of the day the King of Scots nearly died in the mud. Dalry was the final straw. Bruce realized that a large group was just a large target. He did something heartbreaking for a medieval leader. He disbanded his followers. He told his knights to scatter, to hide in the woods, to melt away. He kept only a tiny handful of loyalists, including the young James Douglas. They lived like wolves. They ate raw venison and drank water from ditch streams. They slept in the rain, never staying in the same spot twice. The English commander Aymer de Valence escalated the hunt. He employed sleuth hounds, bloodhounds trained, to track human scent. Chronicles tell a terrifying story from this period. One night, Bruce and his foster brother heard the baying of hounds getting closer. They were alone. Bruce ordered his foster brother to run one way while he ran the other, hoping to split the pack. The hounds didn't split. They stayed locked on Bruce's scent. He was cornered near a stream. Bruce waded into the freezing water, walking upstream for hundreds of yards to wash away his trail, then pulled himself up into the overhanging branches of a tree. He held his breath as the dogs and soldiers passed beneath his feet, sniffing the confused air. The King of Scotland was hiding in a tree like a frightened child. By late 1306, staying on the mainland was suicide. Bruce took a boat and sailed west into the Atlantic mists. He vanished. Some say he went to Rathlin Island off the coast of Ireland. Others say the Hebrides or even Norway. For 4 months, the world assumed he was dead. The English celebrated, the Comyns relaxed. But in the silence of that exile, something shifted. Stripped of his crown, his castles, and his armies, Bruce had nothing left to lose. The arrogance of the aristocrat died in those caves. He stopped thinking like a feudal lord who demanded open battle, and started thinking like an insurgent. If the English wanted to hunt him like a beast, he would become a predator. He would stop trying to be a king and start being a killer. History often wraps ugly truths in pretty fairy tales. We have all heard the story of Robert the Bruce in the cave. The lonely king watches a spider trying to spin a web across a damp opening. The spider falls. It climbs back up. It falls again. Finally, it succeeds. The lesson, we're told, is simple perseverance. If at first you don't succeed, try again. But that is a lesson for children. Robert the Bruce did not need a nursery rhyme. He needed a war strategy. If he actually watched a spider in that dark winter of 1307, he likely saw something far more practical. A spider does not chase its prey. It does not challenge a hornet to a duel. It uses the environment to build a trap. It waits. It strikes only when the enemy is entangled and helpless. The spider is the ultimate practitioner of asymmetric warfare. Bruce emerged from that cave with a new doctrine. He would never again fight a fair fight. He would burn his own castles rather than let the English hold them. He would attack at night. He would target supplies, not soldiers. In the 14th century, this was considered dishonorable, the tactic of bandits. Bruce no longer cared about honor. He cared about winning. He returned to the Scottish mainland in February 1307, landing near Turnberry. He had no army, just a few boatloads of hard men. They vanished into the rugged landscape of the Galloway Hills. The English knew he was back, but they couldn't find him. He was a ghost. The first test of this new spider doctrine came at Glen Truel in April. Aymer de Valence, the man who had crushed Bruce at Methven, marched a heavy column of English soldiers deep into the glen to flush out the fugitive. In the past, Bruce would have met them on the valley floor, shield to shield. Not this time. Bruce positioned his men high up on the steep wooded slopes of the glen. They didn't hold spears. They held levers wedged under massive boulders. As the English columns snaked along the narrow path below, struggling with their heavy armor and horses, the trap was sprung. A signal whistle blew. The Scots heaved. Tons of granite crashed down the mountainside, smashing into the English ranks. Before the dust settled, Bruce's men charged down the slope, engaging in a brutal close-quarters slaughter against an enemy that was already panicked and broken. The English fled. Bruce had won not with numbers but with gravity. But the greatest stroke of luck was not tactical, it was biological. South of the border, the terrifying engine of the English conquest was breaking down. King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, was dying. His dysentery was so severe he could only travel 2 miles a day. Yet his hatred was so intense he forced his army to carry him towards Scotland on a litter. On July 7, 1307, at Burr by Sands, just within sight of the Scottish border, the old tyrant took his final breath. His last orders were grotesque. He commanded that his flesh be boiled from his bones and his skeleton carried at the head of the army until Scotland was conquered. His son, Edward II, ignored the request. He buried his father and immediately turned the army around to go back to London. The pressure on Bruce instantly evaporated. The terrifying shark was gone, replaced by a minnow. Edward II was not his father. He was frivolous, distracted, and deeply unpopular with his own nobles. Bruce saw the board clear. He now had the time and space to weave his web across the entire nation. But before he could drive the English out, he had a darker piece of business to attend to. He had to finish the Civil War. He turned his eyes north toward the lands of the Comyns and the Bookens. He wasn't going there to liberate them. He was going there to destroy them. To understand Robert the Bruce, you must accept a difficult truth. He was a warlord before he was a hero. In 1308, his greatest threat was not the English army stationed in the south. It was his own people in the north. The Comyn family, relatives of the man he murdered in the church, held the earldom of Buchan. They were powerful, wealthy, and hungry for revenge. As long as they stood, Bruce was fighting a war on two fronts, and he knew he could not defeat England while his own backyard was full of knives. But just as he turned his army north, disaster struck. Bruce collapsed. Chronicles do not agree on the cause. Some say a heart attack, others a wasting fever brought on by the years of starvation and sleeping in the freezing mud. He lost the ability to walk. He could not even hold a spoon. His men had to carry him on a litter, a helpless invalid wrapped in furs. While the army of the Earl of Buchan gathered like wolves sensing a dying animal, John Comyn, the Earl of Buchan, saw his chance to finish what the church murder had started. He marched his forces to Inverurie, expecting to massacre a leaderless rabble. He was wrong. Hearing the enemy was near, Bruce demanded to be lifted from his sickbed. His knights hesitated. He insisted. They hoisted him onto his warhorse, likely tying him to the saddle to keep him upright. The sight of their king, pale, shaking, looking like a corpse resurrected for one last fight, sent a shockwave of adrenaline through his men. It had the opposite effect on the Comyns. Seeing the dying king leading the charge terrified them. The Comyn lines broke. The battle turned into out. But winning the battle was not enough. Bruce needed to ensure the Comyns could never rise again. He ordered a campaign of systematic destruction that is remembered in Scottish history as the Hership of Buchan, the harrying of Buchan. This was not warfare, it was erasure. Bruce's soldiers fanned out across the rich farmlands of Aberdeenshire. They did not just kill the armed men, they burned every village, every barn, and every granary. They slaughtered the livestock and left the carcasses to rot in the wells, poisoning the water sources. They set fire to the vast timber forests, turning the wealth of the region to ash. The goal was to create a wasteland so absolute that no army could march through it and no lord could tax it. Bruce effectively starved a significant portion of his own population to secure his crown. The destruction was so thorough that people spoke of it in hushed tones for 50 years afterward. The Comyn power base was not just defeated, it was vaporized. The survivors fled to England or died of famine in the smoking ruins of their homes. Bruce had committed a brutal act of civil war. He had turned the northeast of Scotland into a graveyard to protect the rest of the kingdom. It was a cold, mathematical calculation, sacrifice the part to save the whole, with the north finally silent. Silent because it was dead. Bruce could finally turn his eyes south. He had unified Scotland, not with diplomacy, but with fire. Now he needed to reclaim the fortresses that choked his country. But he wouldn't use siege engines. He would use thieves. With the north subdued, Robert the Bruce faced a geometry problem. Scotland was locked down by a network of English-held castles. These were not just buildings, they were stone monsters that projected power over the countryside. Bruce had no siege engines, he had no trebuchets to smash walls, and no months to waste starving them out. So he turned the war into a heist movie. He unleashed his captains, James Douglas and Thomas Randolph, to do the impossible. They did not attack these fortresses, they burgled them. Take the capture of Roxburgh Castle in February 1314. This was a massive stronghold critical for controlling the border. James Douglas knew he couldn't storm the gates. Instead, he hired a local craftsman named Sim of the Lead House to fashion special rope ladders with padded iron hooks that wouldn't clang against the stone. Douglas waited for Shrove Tuesday, the night before Lent begins. He knew the English garrison would be feasting and drinking, lowering their guard for one last night of excess. Under the cloak of darkness, Douglas and 60 men covered their armor with black cloaks. They got down on their hands and knees and crept through the fields toward the castle walls. From the ramparts, an English sentry peered into the gloom. He saw dark shapes moving slowly in the grass. "Look," he reportedly said to his comrade. "The farmer has left his cattle out late. He thought they were cows. They were not cows." Once they reached the base of the wall, the cattle stood up, threw their hooks, and swarmed up the ladders. They burst into the great hall, screaming, "A Douglas! A Douglas!" The drunken garrison never stood a chance. The castle fell in minutes. Weeks later, Bruce's nephew, Thomas Randolph, faced an even harder challenge. Edinburgh Castle, sitting atop a sheer volcanic plug, was considered impregnable, but Randolph found a man named William Francis who had served in the castle years before. Francis confessed a secret. As a young man, he had discovered a terrifyingly steep goat path down the rock face to visit a girl in the town below. On a moonless night, Randolph and 30 men followed Francis up the vertical cliff. It was a suicide mission. One slip meant death. Halfway up, they froze. An English guard on the wall above paused, looked down into the black abyss, and picked up a stone. "I see you!" the guard shouted and threw the stone into the darkness. The rock clattered past Randolph's men. They pressed themselves into the cliff face, hearts hammering, expecting a rain of arrows. But no arrows came. The guard laughed and walked away. He had been joking, throwing a rock at nothing to spook his friends. He had no idea 30 Scots were clinging to the wall beneath him. Relieved but shaken, they finished the climb, scaled the wall, and opened the gates. Edinburgh was theirs. But here is where Robert the Bruce showed his true genius. A traditional king would have moved into these castles, garrisoned them, and flown his flag. Bruce did the opposite. He ordered them destroyed. This policy was known as slighting. Bruce knew that if he kept the castles, the English could simply return with a larger army and take them back. A castle was a trap for a small army, so he tore them down. He leveled the walls, filled the wells, and burned the timber. He made the fortifications useless. It was a radical anti-feudal strategy. Bruce was telling his people that their defense lay not in stone walls, but in their mobility and their willingness to fight in the open. By the suit, Memor of 1314, only one major English stronghold remained in Scotland, Stirling Castle. And that is where the trap snapped shut. Edward Bruce, Robert's impulsive brother, had made a foolish gentleman's agreement with the English governor of Stirling. He agreed that if the castle wasn't relieved by midsummer, it would surrender. This forced the hand of the new English king, Edward II. He couldn't ignore the challenge. He gathered the largest army ever to leave England, over 20,000 men, heavy cavalry and archers, and marched north to crush the Scots once and for all. Bruce's days of guerrilla warfare were over. He had run out of room to hide. He had to stand and fight. June 23, 1314, the longest day of the year, was about to become the darkest for the English aristocracy. Edward II marched north with a leviathan of an army, over 2,000 heavy armored cavalry and 15,000 infantry. It was a moving city of steel stretching for miles along the Roman road. Against this, Robert the Bruce could muster perhaps 6,000 spearmen and a handful of light horsemen. By any conventional metric, the Scots were already dead. But Bruce was not fighting a conventional battle. He had chosen his ground at the Battle of Bannockburn with the precision of an architect. He positioned his men in the New Park, a wooded area that neutralized the English numbers. To his right ran the Bannockburn, a stream with steep, muddy banks. To his front he laid a nightmare trap. Bruce ordered his men to dig hundreds of knee-deep pits known as pots, camouflaged with sticks and grass. These were designed to snap the legs of charging horses. He also scattered caltrops, twisted metal spikes that always land point up, across the field. He turned the flat ground into a killing zone. As the English vanguard approached, the air was thick with heat and dust. Suddenly, a young English knight named Henry de Bohun spotted a golden opportunity. He saw a figure riding alone in front of the Scottish lines. The man was wearing a gold circlet on his helmet. It was the king. Bruce was not on a war horse. He was riding a small, agile gray palfrey, inspecting his lines. He carried no lance, only a battle-axe. De Bohun, mounted on a massive destrier and fully armored, lowered his lance. He saw glory. He saw the end of the war in a single charge. He spurred his horse and thundered toward the Scottish king. Thousands of men on both sides froze. This was a scene from the Iliad, a duel of champions. Bruce's commanders screamed at him to retreat. He ignored them. He sat motionless on his pony as the English knight bore down on him, the lance tip aiming straight for his chest. At the very last second, just as the lance was about to strike, Bruce yanked his reins. His pony sidestepped. The lance passed harmlessly through the air. In that split second, as de Bohun thundered past, Bruce stood up in his stirrups and swung his axe with every ounce of his strength. The blade struck de Bohun's helmet. The impact was so violent it reportedly split the knight's head from crown to chin. De Bohun hit the ground dead before his horse even stopped running. Bruce returned to his lines, calm and composed. His generals were furious. scolding him for risking the entire kingdom on a moment of madness. Yet Bruce simply looked at the splintered shaft in his hand and muttered a complaint that has become legendary. "I have broken my axe." That single blow won the battle before it fully began. The English watched their champion destroyed by a man on a pony. The Scots saw their king as a giant. Morale shifted like the tide, but the English were not done. Later that afternoon, their cavalry tried to flank the Scots. They ran straight into the pots in the Scottish spear wall, the schiltron. The English knights, arrogant and disorganized, were repulsed. As night fell, the English army camped on the wet, marshy ground of the Carse, demoralized and cramped. The Scots slept in the woods, high on adrenaline. Bruce faced a choice in the darkness. He had won the skirmish, but the main English army was still intact. Should he withdraw into the hills and declare a moral victory? Or should he stay and fight the largest army in Christendom at dawn? A defector from the English camp, Alexander Seton, crept across the lines with a message. "Sir, the English have lost heart. If you attack tomorrow, you will have them." Bruce looked at his men. He looked at the fires of the English camp. He decided to roll the dice. Dawn broke on June 24, 1314. The English army was exhausted. They had spent the night in the marshy Carse, standing in mud, fearful of a surprise attack that never came. As the sun rose, they saw an impossible sight. The Scottish army was not retreating into the woods. They were marching out into the open plain. They knelt in prayer. King Edward II, watching from a distance, reportedly laughed. "They are kneeling," he said. "They ask for mercy." "They do," replied one of his counselors, "but not from you. These men will conquer or die." Edward ordered the attack. The Earl of Gloucester, eager to prove his loyalty, led the heavy cavalry in a thunderous charge. It was a suicide run. The Scots had formed into massive schiltrons, circular formations bristling with 12-foot pikes. They were giant armored hedgehogs. When the English horses slammed into these walls of steel, the momentum reversed instantly. Horses were skewered. Knights were thrown to the ground and butchered. The Earl of Gloucester was killed almost immediately. The English vanguard shattered. But the real horror was the geography. Robert the Bruce had trapped the massive English army in a bottleneck between the schiltrons and the Bannockburn stream. As the rear ranks of the English pressed forward, eager to fight, they crushed their own front lines against the Scottish spears. The battlefield became a claustrophobic nightmare. Chronicles describe the press of bodies as so tight that men could not even lift their arms to swing their swords. Knights suffocated inside their helmets. Those who fell were trampled into the mud by their own comrades. The English archers, usually the deadliest weapon in the medieval arsenal, were useless. They couldn't shoot without hitting their own men. When they tried to deploy to the flank, Bruce unleashed his light cavalry, led by Sir Robert Keith, to scatter them. The trap was perfect. The invincible English army was being ground into paste. The Bannockburn began to fill with bodies, so many that men could cross the stream dry by walking on the corpses of the fallen. Then came the psychological breaking point. On Gillies Hill behind the Scottish lines, a chaotic mob appeared. These were the small folk, camp followers, women, priests, and servants, who had been watching from Fetty. Seeing their countrymen winning, they grabbed pots, pans, and makeshift weapons, charging down the hill screaming war cries. To the panicked English, this looked like a second Scottish army arriving to finish the slaughter. Their nerves snapped. The retreat turned into a rout. Edward II, realizing the day was lost, fled the field, pursued closely by James Douglas. He left behind his shield, his seal, and thousands of his subjects to die. The slaughter of the fleeing English was absolute. The Bannockburn ran red for miles. The Battle of Bannockburn was not just a victory, it was the total annihilation of English military power in the north. Bruce stood amidst the carnage, the master of the field. He had taken a broken, divided nation and forged it into a weapon capable of breaking an empire. But as the plunder was counted, gold, armor, and noble prisoners worth fortunes in ransom, Bruce knew that winning the war was only half the battle. He now had to win the peace, and for that, he would need a weapon sharper than any sword, a pen. Victory at Bannockburn should have been the end. In a movie, the credits would roll as the English ran away. In reality, the war dragged on for another 14 exhausting years. Robert the Bruce had won the battle, but he had not won recognition. The English king refused to call him king, referring to him only as Sir Robert. The Pope kept him excommunicated, a spiritual outcast destined for hellfire. Bruce realized that swords alone could not break this deadlock. He needed to expand the war to break England's spirit. In 1315 he opened a second front. He sent his brother Edward Bruce to invade Ireland. The plan was ambitious: unite the Celtic fringes, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, into a grand alliance against England. It was a disaster. The timing could not have been worse. Europe was hit by the Great Famine of 1315. Constant rain turned fields into swamps. Crops rotted in the ground. The Scottish army in Ireland didn't come as liberators. They came as another mouth to feed in a starving land. Chronicles from this period are the stuff of nightmares. They describe soldiers digging up graves to eat the corpses. In Ulster, people reportedly ate their own children to survive. The pan-Celtic dream dissolved in mud and cannibalism. Edward Bruce, the king's brother, was defeated and killed at the Battle of Faughart in 1318. His body was quartered, and his head was salted in a bucket, and sent to King Edward II as a grisly birthday present. The Irish failure taught Bruce a hard lesson. He could not conquer his neighbor. He had to convince the world that Scotland was a sovereign nation, not a rebellious province. In 1320, he gathered his nobles at Arbroath Abbey to draft a letter to Pope John XX. We know this document today as the Declaration of Arbroath. It is arguably the most important document in Scottish history, and perhaps one of the most significant in the history of democracy. Though most royal petitions of the time were groveling lists of complaints, the Declaration of Arbroath was different. It was a roar of defiance written in elegant Latin. It retold the mythological history of the Scots. But then it dropped a political bombshell. It stated clearly that Robert the Bruce was king only because he protected the people's freedom. It contained a clause that was revolutionary for the Middle Ages. Yet if he should give up what he has begun, and agree to make us or our kingdom subject to the King of England or the English, we should exert ourselves at once to drive him out as our enemy, and a subverter of his own rights and ours, and make some other man who is well able to defend us our king. Read that again. The nobles were saying they would depose Bruce if he sold them out. The king was not chosen by God to rule unconditionally. He was hired by the people to do a job. If he failed, he was fired. This was the contractual theory of monarchy, written 450 years before the American Declaration of Independence. And then came the lines that still echo today: "For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself." The Pope was listening. The diplomatic ice began to crack. Finally, in 1328, a beaten and broken England signed the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. They formally renounced all claims to Scotland. They recognized Robert the Bruce as the rightful king. The struggle was over. Robert the Bruce had done it. He had taken a fractured, occupied country and forged it into an independent state recognized by the powers of Europe. But the cost was etched into his own body. The king was 54 years old, but he looked 80. A mysterious illness, perhaps leprosy, perhaps a severe skin condition caused by years of stress, was eating him alive. The warrior had one final battle to fight, and it was one he could not win with an axe. By 1329, the Lion of Scotland was dying. At his manor in Redross, Robert the Bruce lay in bed, a shriveled shell of the warrior who had split skulls at Bannockburn. The mysterious illness had taken his strength, leaving him too weak to stand, but his conscience was still active. Bruce carried a heavy spiritual burden. He had never been absolved for the murder of John Comyn in the church. He had spent his life fighting Christians, English and Scots, instead of fulfilling his vow to go on crusade to the Holy Land. He was a king, but he was afraid he was dying a sinner. He summoned his oldest friend, James Douglas. The two men had been through everything together, from the starving winters in the heather to the glory of the battlefield. Bruce made a final grotesque request. He asked that when he died, his heart be cut from his chest, placed in a silver casket, and carried to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. If he couldn't go to God in life, his heart would go in death. On June 7, 1329, Robert the Bruce took his final breath. He was 54. James Douglas, true to his word, had the king's heart embalmed and placed in a silver enameled case, which he wore around his neck on a chain. He gathered a company of knights and set sail, not just as a pilgrimage but as a mobile army. They never made it to Jerusalem. They stopped in Spain to help the King of Castile fight the Moorish armies of Granada. At the Battle of Teba in August 1330, Douglas saw a chance to do what he did best: charge. He spurred his horse forward, breaking the enemy line. But this time he was too eager. He was cut off and surrounded by Saracen cavalry. Realizing there was no escape, Douglas took the silver casket from his neck. He swung it by the chain and hurled it deep into the mass of enemy soldiers, shouting a line that has echoed through the ages. "Now pass thou onward as thou wert wont, and Douglas will follow thee or die." Douglas charged after his king's heart and was cut down. He died fighting, just as he had lived. The survivors recovered Douglas's body and the silver casket. They brought them back to a mourning Scotland. The body of King Robert was buried in Dunfermline Abbey under a grand marble tomb imported from Paris, but his heart was buried separately at Melrose Abbey in the Borders, a region he had spent his life defending. So how should we remember Robert the Bruce? History has tried to sanitize him. We build statues of him in heroic poses. We put him on shortbread tins. We make movies where he is a reluctant, soft-spoken hero. But the truth is far more compelling. Bruce was not a fairy tale knight. He was a user who murdered his rival in a church. He was a general who burned his own people's farms and destroyed his own castles. He was a politician who changed sides whenever it suited him. He was ruthless, calculating, zealous, and often brutal. And that's exactly why he succeeded. Scotland didn't need a martyr like William Wallace. Martyrs are noble, but they are dead. Scotland needed a survivor. It needed a man willing to damn his own soul to save his kingdom. Bruce took a country that was effectively erased from the map and, through sheer force of will, wrote it back into existence. He proved that a king isn't defined by the crown on his head but by the scars on his conscience. If you found this journey into the dark reality of Scottish history fascinating, please like and subscribe to Crimson Legacy Historians. There are thousands of other forgotten stories we need to uncover together. And let me know in the comments, do you think Bruce's ends justified his means? Or was the murder of Comyn an unforgivable stain on his legacy? We'll see you in the next video, where we might just take a look at the man Bruce hated most, the terrifying Edward Longshanks himself. Until then, keep questioning the history books.